Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. On behalf of the University Honors College and Dr. John Weil, our Dean, I welcome all of you here today. This is a lecture series that's devoted to American values. And for those of you unfamiliar with the Honors College or our lecture series, this is both a class that is required for students who are planning to graduate from the Honors College. It's also an event that's free and open to the public. We try to come up with interesting, stimulating topics each semester, and we invite a combination of speakers from on campus and off campus to address aspects of that topic. We're particularly interested in getting speakers from different disciplinary perspectives, and because everyone in this class all of you are from different backgrounds, many of you have different majors, and you span all the disciplines on campus, it makes for a stimulating intellectual environment. So that's what our lecture series is all about. It's a 1-hour pass-fail class, but again, it's also an event that is free and open to the public. So I welcome all of you who are visiting the class. I hope that you enjoyed today's lecture, and I encourage you to come back to as many of these as you want to attend. I'm particularly pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Mary Evins. Those of you who were here last time may remember I said a few words about Dr. Evins, but I'll say again that I'm very fortunate to have Dr. Mary Evins as our co-facilitator and co-organizer for this semester's series. In fact, I would give the majority of the credit for this series to Dr. Evins. And if you look at the lineup of speakers, I think you'll be impressed with the diverse range that we have represented there, and I think it's going to be a fantastic semester. Dr. Evins is a research associate professor affiliated with both the Department of History and the University Honors College here at MTSU. She's been with history for 13 years, and she's been a resident faculty member of the Honors College for the past 2 years, and we're very glad to have her here in our building. Dr. Evins earned her undergraduate degree in history and anthropology from Vanderbilt University and her master's and PhD in cultural history from the University of Chicago. She's also held doctoral fellowships at the American Research Institute in Turkey and the Smithsonian Institution. Her graduate fieldwork was supported by the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute and the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique en Paris, France. Since returning to her home state of Tennessee, Dr. Evins published her edited volume, Tennessee's New Women in the New South During the Progressive Era, Their Work in the Public Sphere, with the University of Tennessee Press in 2013. She's currently working on the second volume, also dealing with Tennessee Progressive Era women's work in preparation for the Tennessee Centennial of the 19th Amendment, that is the vote for women, the celebration of which is coming up in 2 years in 2020. In recent years, Dr. Evins has been the principal investigator of a National Endowment for the Humanities Bridging Cultures at Community Colleges grant program for the Tennessee Board of Regents, which seeks to promote engaged teaching for civic learning, civil dialogue, cultural understanding, and social justice as broadly as possible across Tennessee colleges, counties, and communities. Since 2009, Dr. Evins has served as the director of the American Democracy Project for the Office of the Provost and for the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, putting civil learning at the forefront of the university's identity. She oversees student voting and voter registration for the university and organizes programming for MTSU's Constitution Day every year. I think it's clear to all of us, and will be even clearer after her talk, that Dr. Evins is a committed advocate for civil learning across the disciplines. civil discourse, and American values, about which she will be speaking today in her keynote presentation on American values, as they are both immutable and adapting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Evins.
Hey everybody, I'm told there's no actual microphone, so you get my teacher voice today. So Dean Phillips asked me to be the lead-in lecturer for this spring series, to provide the overview, to give some context and framework, and how we're going to integrate and interpret these ideas in the weeks ahead. And I look forward to this. I look forward to engaging with all of us as we do so this spring, and I thank him for asking me. And I'm pleased to share a few concepts. For a professor who's used to talking, you know, 50 minutes is pretty darn short, but maybe we can frame a few things together that will help spur our learning and thinking together. So we brought together this assemblage of scholarship and wisdom and subject matter that Dean Phillips referred to for your consideration, and you have that list now as part of your syllabus. You have the course flyer that you have in your course notebook. So I won't explicitly run through these this afternoon, but I will refer to one or two of them as we go through the talk this afternoon as they pertain to points that I want to make. And what I need to be clear, as you understand from the outset, is that American values permeate, are embedded in, and form the basis of every single discipline in which we engage in life. And no matter your major, your college, your department, or your chosen professional pathway, no matter where you live, small town or big city, another state, or here in Tennessee, anywhere around the world, American values are weirdly going to be a part of you. They impact you, and I go so far as to say that they really are who you are if you're an American citizen. And if you're not an American citizen and you live in this country, our values are critical to you every day as well. So these are important, they impact us, and they're intertwined across nations as well. We have American values have an impact globally. And whether or not you want your mind to go there, we live in this global world in which the attitudes, actions, and behaviors of all nations directly impact the bearing of our lives. So we, therefore, are a big impact on others. So none of us is very far from this topic. And again, whatever major you may be majoring in or whatever professional pathway you're on, they're critical to the work you do, who you become, and what you stand for. So you can see from the highlighted subject areas this spring that there are sadly too few weeks in the semester, and maybe we're not covering a lecture in your major. But we apologize for that. We're counting on you individually to apply and connect and transfer important ideas to your own learning and to your own profession and your own experiences and your own understanding. So where to begin this exploration? I've given this some thought, and I've thought about it and thought about it. So there are so many pathways to go down, so many framings that I consider important, so many ways we can begin to look at national values. The possible paradigms really are infinite, so I'm simply picking and choosing, and I'm selecting a few ideas that are important to me. And let me just here initially say that just as an overview of the framings I consider important, these are the ones that I talk about typically with my students in my U.S. history classes. In my classes, my students and I often discuss and debate on a regular basis a fundamental distinction that characterized American colonization from the very beginning. So I'm picking to focus on Jamestown, founded in 1607, the beginning of the Chesapeake colonies, the first permanent English settlement in North America, sent to the Americas by the Virginia Investment Company. And Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies, first settled by the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the Separatists. They're the second English settlement that's permanent in North America, beginning in 1620. And to be clear, I'm already orchestrating the thought process here because obviously indigenous peoples were already here long before the English. So-called native peoples immigrated, migrated in numerous repetitive waves of exploration and adaptation and expansion from Asia, perhaps 20 to 25,000 years ago, certainly by 12 to 15,000 years ago, and they lived in very sophisticated, complex societies all across the continent and the eastern seaboard. Also, the Spanish had settled in North America for 100 years by the 1600s, all across the west coast, the southwest, and in the southeast indeed. And For those of you who've been to St. Augustine, Florida, that's been continuously occupied since the latter part of the 1500s. So our national story is layered, complex, and rich by definition. But since our narrative is built on a strong British colony identity, we can look to Virginia and Massachusetts as starting points, which in broadest generalization can be boiled down baseline to perhaps money versus morality or materialism versus morals. The Virginia Investment Company sought a return on its dollar, return on its investment, and the Puritans took a risk in all that they had to worship it as they saw fit. So we have here sort of a dichotomy between the American dream for forward financial advancement versus how we as individuals impact others, sort of our jobs versus our rights, greed versus the common good, reducing my inheritance tax or my income tax versus society's need for schools, infrastructure, and health care. Financial cost versus spiritual cost. A lot can be boiled down to this dichotomy or this lens if you choose to view it that way. Obviously, American value system is much more complex. This is just a simple framework. And bear in mind that this sort of two polarizing ideas are at the core of a lot of our current thorny problems, stubborn issues that we continue to grapple with, and honestly, were well articulated by the first settlers beginning in the 1600s. These two poles have characterized us from our early days, and they are both part of our national DNA. The American dream and the city on the hill. Jesus used those words, so did John Winthrop, so did Ronald Reagan. We follow the American dream for our own financial betterment, but we also want to be this moral icon, a model of equality and democracy. And I think what we really do is like to keep them in balance. And when they get out of balance, we try to rectify that and tend to shift them back so that they stay a little bit equal in terms of what they are within our own lives. So both are American values, and we want to advance financially and be virtuous as a model. As John Winthrop wrote in his famous sermon to the Massachusetts Bay Pilgrims in 1630, a model of Christian charity. Winthrop said, "Love, mercy, gentleness, temperance, that every man might have need of others, and from hence they might all knit more nearly together in the bonds of brotherly affection, whereby we are to walk one towards another in justice and mercy." And in terms of foundational American principles, I myself personally just couldn't stop right there, and I dwell on the founding values of Governor Winthrop, who went on to say that the rich and the mighty should not eat up the poor. Again, I'm quoting from Winthrop here. "Man is commanded to love his neighbor as himself. Upon this ground stand all the precepts of moral law, which concern our dealings with men, and to apply this to the works of mercy require two things. First, that every man afford his help to another in every want or distress. And secondly, that he perform this out of the same affection which makes him careful of his own works. So do good to all, and the gospel commands love to an enemy. If thine enemy hunger, feed him. Love your enemies. Do good to them that hate you." There was a time when a Christian must sell all and give to the poor, as they did in the apostles' time. And there's a time when Christians must give beyond their ability. Likewise, community calls for extraordinary liberality. We must help beyond our ability. This duty of mercy is exercised in giving, lending, and forgiving a debt. So maybe we'd best conceive of this baseline, this starting point of American values, most assuredly as and versus versus, meaning American values are what we aspire to. We want financial success, but we also carry within our bones this desire to be morally virtuous, as did the Pilgrims, and honestly, as did the Virginia Anglicans. Putting a positive spin on this, to succeed and to be virtuous are both essential to Puritan heritage, and they were equally important to the Virginians. And for us today, even if we did not arrive here in the 1600s, and most of us didn't really, we don't have to have been aboard one of those historic ships that are in the history books. We might assess which should come first. Should it be more virtue or more financial success? I'm unsure, but since the colony of Jamestown preceded Massachusetts by a few years, we'll leave it in that order. So to aim for the American dream is absolutely a fundamental American value which we all aspire. And that's one of the reasons that you're here in college. I would argue that there are two other significant reasons you're here in college, but we can come back to that later. But certainly your professional well-being so that you will have financial success is a piece of that. And along with success in our collective Puritan piety, we think we are good people, we Americans. We conceive of ourselves as simple, plain, honest, not puffed up, humble. It's something we care about. We believe this of ourselves, and we want to be global role models in this regard. Again, the city on the hill image, and we call on ourselves to be above reproach. We hold ourselves and our public servants to this national standard of moral quality and moral excellence. We want them to represent us, to be our national role model. And while we have not migrated too far from our colonial roots in this homily, let's discuss another baseline American value with which we grapple daily, and that one that should have actually been settled a long, long time ago, our American diversity. So yes, the very first permanent settlers who came here from across the Atlantic were English, and most of Americans today are not dominantly English, so how do we rectify that confusion? We did inherit the English judicial system, the legal system, the governing system, but we are a rich ethnic plurality in this country, Asian and South American, European of every national origin, African, Middle Eastern, from India, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Venezuela, Scotland, Ghana, Spain, Afghanistan, Korea, Sri Lanka, Germany, Somalia, Vietnam, Lithuania, you name it. We're from across the globe. We also come from Turkey and Zimbabwe, Croatia, Bangladesh, El Salvador, and Haiti. You get it. We're the veritable beacon of welcome to people from across the globe. Our national and ethnic diversity is hallmark to who we are, and it characterizes us, it defines us, and we're a pluralistic people who are built on arrival to these shores, coming by whatever means. Some of us arrived stolen and enslaved, others walked. We arrived to be sent to prison or to indenture. We arrived legally and illegally, smuggled some of us, or on top of the deck in the finest quarters for others. We lived in poverty and destitution with only the clothes on our back, and some arrived broken and ignoble with no clothes much to speak of at all. And the incredible American value that awaited us was to be received in and integrated into this new world, this new country. So yeah, there's an enormous diversity of Americans, and our becoming American together is one of our greatest and finest and most noble American values, for which we are applauded and recognized and known worldwide. And we're a nation apart because of it. We embrace it. Intellectual and writer Randolph Bourne wrote in 1916, so exactly 100 years ago, in the throes of the divisiveness over World War I, that the glory of America is our beloved community, he said, of differences in our immigrant culture. It was interesting to me because beloved community here is being used long before the American Civil Rights Movement, and I wonder where he got it. So if someone knows, please tell me. But he was attempting to mitigate the differences that were paramount 100 years back. So we're very honored to have coming to MTSU the first Monday after spring break, so don't linger down in Fort Lauderdale, get yourself back here, in order to hear Ms. Qasar Abdullah, who is recognized at the White House as a national champion of change, speak on March 12th at this lecture series about this very topic of American value of immigration and immigrants as being core to who we are. So when I hear phraseology bandied about, as we heard in Murfreesboro just a number of months ago about "you will not replace us," or I hear phrases like that, and I think it's absolutely nuts because, or maybe it should be hubris. If you don't know that word, look it up. Replacing us is an idea that we need to reconsider at so many different levels. And having just said that, when I say that's nuts, I want to insert here that education is another very important fundamental American value. Education dates to our earliest settlement, from the Puritan horn books to the early colleges that were found by our founders and framers, including science in the United States Constitution. The Founding Fathers themselves were incredibly educated. They asked us to promote the progress of science. Horace Mann taught us in the early part of the 1800s about the foundations of education for democracy. We expanded higher education in this country. We conceived of a public education system. The Reconstruction schools happened after the Civil War. John Dewey powerfully wrote on the proper functioning of democracy and the need for citizens to be citizen scholars. We followed with the GI Bill after World War II, and Brown versus Board by the Supreme Court told us we open education in this country to all. Moving from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to the U.S. Department of Education, all of these factors have indicated how important education is in American society and as a value in our democracy. Because we understand that education is a component piece of how we become better citizens and how democracy works. I'll go into this to say that the American focus on education is based on the fact that Americans value thinking, and there is a strong defense for the integrity of knowledge. Rational thought, representing and respecting facts and truth, and examining and re-examining one's own ideas and biases and convictions, analyzing and evaluating evidence. These are topics I spoke about in this lecture series actually a year ago, that academic values and American values are actually one and the same. To promote education is to promote democracy and the U.S. Constitution, and an assault on education is an assault on democracy. These are concomitant values that we share. Aspects of academic values are about discussing across difference, having civil dialogue, examining information, using well-founded and researched information as a way to come to smart and informed conclusions. These are all critical in a properly functioning democracy. Our system of government was built on rational thinking, on the ideas and principles of the Enlightenment. David Brooks, who is a Yale professor and a New York Times essayist, in February of last year, argues that the United States itself is an Enlightenment project, but that we are on rocky ground right now because our finest, most fundamental American values are imperiled. And we as Americans are called on by our Constitution to be rational thinkers, to be, if you will, academic thinkers. Brooks says that the U.S. Constitution is the quintessential Enlightenment document because of its rational system of checks and balances, acknowledging that one faction will pit itself against another, so the entire structure in government are built on rules in which competing interests have guards and protections to ensure the whole. The U.S. indeed, in this grand experiment in Enlightenment, is important because we have to adhere to rules. That's what our Constitution is. And when these rules of engagement are broken, we undermine the entire Enlightenment project. And he argues that an anti-Enlightenment movement is currently in full swing. The rules of government are in place, but being hostile to them, cutting down the judiciary system, for example, calling respected structures of government the administrative state, being pejorative about the very foundations of democracy in which they're called into question, causes people to lose faith in government and to put it down and to be suspicious, rather than holding it as the model that our values are heralded to be. And while Brooks argues that our entire set of American values is under attack, that when rational thinking dies, Berkeley UCal professor George Lakoff says that rationality rarely sets in, and that actually, to be rational thinkers, we have to seriously, proactively work at that, and that what is often at play are our feelings, our unconscious, and our emotions, which is why, and political scientists know this from decades of research, that people often vote their gut, not their personal, rational self-interest. Like average working people working for the party of money and the 1% and expecting an outcome that favors working people is a classic case in point. So we have to educate ourselves to be enlightened, and thus education is crucial to democracy, to keeping our democracy function, to keep it going, as Benjamin Franklin knew we had to do. David Brooks says that the anti-establishment movement right now, the anti-enlightenment movement, is denigrating evidence-based inquiry, and it obfuscates, undermines, and clouds the truth, which sets us up for that other critically important American value, a free and unrestrained press, which is the Fourth Estate. Now, everybody knows the First Amendment, and you can all likely quote it, and we all value it. It's one of the most respected, complex, and honored parts of the U.S. Constitution. We could spend all hour, all semester, years in institutions, as many do, focusing on this particular issue. We have wonderful institutions right here close to us. The First Amendment Center in Nashville, which is affiliated with Vanderbilt University. It was founded by Tennessean and journalist Mr. John Siegenthaler, and it now bears his name. And there is also right here at MTSU the Siegenthaler Chair of Excellence in First Amendment Studies. MTSU's own Dean Ken Paulson of the College of Media and Entertainment is the president of the National First Amendment Center, while dean here and overseeing First Amendment studies at MTSU. That's all background and context to inform you that you have so many resources on First Amendment studies and those sorts of American values associated with it. I honestly won't spend time on this other than to recommend that if you haven't seen the new film The Post with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep about the publication of the Pentagon Papers that just came out this winter, then you need to go see it. The last time in my lifetime that I saw an assault on the press as virulent as is happening in the present day was indeed during the Nixon administration. And I say this out of no vociferous political persuasion because I went to school with the Nixon daughters. My mother was a friend of Mrs. Nixon. My father was a friend of President Nixon. They were family friends and acquaintances. But I've seen it before and I'm seeing it again. History operates in cycles. So you and your generation have to observe and be very critical and cautious about anything that smacks of ongoing attacks on the press. I call on you to stand firm for the fundamental American value of an unrestrained press that founds its articles on research, facts, and deep empirically based reporting. So many powerful voices are saying this now and are standing up for what we know is right. One of those is retired four-star admiral and former Navy SEAL William McRaven, who refers to the attack on the press as the greatest threat to democracy that he's ever seen. He's the gentleman who oversaw the highly risky operation that brought down Osama bin Laden a number of years ago. And he says, the news media have not always been kind to me, he says of himself, but he also says that he has engaged with the press in over 90 countries around the world, and the United States has the finest press corps that he has ever seen, bar none is his phraseology, and that the free press is our country's most important institution. Certainly one of them, and there are many more, but he's happy to defend it, and as he did with his life. So there are many more voices along these lines, and there should be no equivocation on this point. Another one about which there should be no equivocation is religious freedom. I've already mentioned the First Amendment Center. There are two of them actually, the one in Nashville and the one in Washington, D.C. It's a go-to entity for everything you want to learn and research about the First Amendment. And under its auspices is a religious freedom center. At MTSU here in the Honors College, just this past fall for MT Engage Week, we were involved in a very fine Finding Shared Truths Among Our Differing Faiths interfaith panel with the Rutherford County Interfaith Council here in Murfreesboro. The history of religious diversity is deep in this country, and one cannot understand the differences and divisions unless you do actually a study in history. And historically, working forward from the very earliest human society's polytheistic faiths to Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, early Christianity, early Islam, and their global spreads. There were subsequently divisions within Christianity, the separation between Eastern and Western Christian churches that ripped Christianity apart into sectors about 1,000 years ago. And then the Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians ripped apart Europe beginning in the early 1500s when monk Martin Luther nailed his 95 complaints or objections against the Catholic Church to the door of a cathedral in Wittenberg, Germany. And if you want to study religious studies, the philosophy department here at MTSU has wonderful coursework for you. The start of the Protestant Reformation opened a floodgate of ideas and new thinking and new ways to read the Bible and multiple different interpretations, and from it many churches sprang into being with many different religious leaders and many different thinkers of the day. One of the offshoots of Catholicism came to be the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, beginning in the early 1500s, and now it's called the Episcopal Church here in the U.S. And vast, unimaginable hatreds and killings took place in England about religion in those years, which was referred to as the era of the English Reformation, and it pitted the English Church, the Church of England, against those who had differing perspectives, Catholics and then others. And once the Church of England became entrenched and became fully separated from the Catholic Church, there were those already who saw its flaws, and they soon believed there was an imperative to cleanse the English Church, and they wanted to purify the Church of England, the Puritans, and they were reviled and they were mistreated, so they came to the New World beginning in 1620. Which brings us back to this map again. So I post this to let you know that since our founding, we've been consumed by religious differences. And although today we look back on the space between Christian Puritanism and Christian Anglican Church, and those seem to be very small, that difference, from our current 21st century vantage point. But in their day, in the 1600s, they were arch enemies. And in just a few years, back in England, the English will fight in a layered and complex and bitter English civil war that will pit these two parties against each other. And now, 150 years later, after the American Civil War, we're still healing from our own Civil War. Is it quite over? We're still wafting about the Confederate flag, so just bear in mind that the British Civil War, which we tend not to study here in the States, was vicious and had a long-term impact on attitudes and camps and animosities. Meanwhile, here in the United States, not only were these two, although the early part of our settlements in the English sections of this continent, but Catholics settled here, and Quakers and Baptists and Anabaptists and Dutch Reformed and Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutheran and Amish and from Germany and Hutterites and Huguenots and Deists and Jews and Muslims and Baha'i and Hindu and Sikhs and Buddhists and Shinto and even Zoroastrians. Wikipedia tells me there are 11,000 Zoroastrians in the United States today. I've only grazed the surface. Once here in the U.S., of course, we began to separate even more, and there are all sorts of new religions that sprang up right here in the United States. The Church of Christ is one of those, and the Pentecostals, and the Ghost Dance religion, and Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormons. And again, I've only grazed the surface. We've been a breeding ground of religious difference because we have no state religion. People are free to follow their conscience into agnosticism even, and into atheism, and into Wiccan. So the very founding of this new country on settlements with religious diversity was the first stage that was set. Then people came here to get away from their old norms and restrictions. That was very foundational to how we think. And then we had Roger Williams. He was one of our national Puritan founding fathers to whom freedom of religion, freedom of worship, is usually formally ascribed, or also perhaps Anne Hutchinson, who refused to be told how to worship and how she could speak directly to God. The two of them were banished out of Puritan, Massachusetts, and they moved south a little bit into what's now Rhode Island, and they established new colonies around Narragansett Bay. Roger Williams is remembered for that, but he was a very fine minister who wrote a great deal, and he talked about individual liberty of conscience and soul liberty, and this lively experiment into religious diversity. That was his powerful legacy that he gave to the United States, and it was codified 150 years later into the United States Constitution's First Amendment. Williams is considered the founder of the Baptist Church in America, And Rhode Island itself became a haven for Baptists and Quakers and Jews and other religious minorities. And nearly a century after his death, his notion of a wall of separation, which he first utilized in a writing in London in 1644, was adopted and adapted by Thomas Jefferson, who spoke of the wall of separation that was inevitable between church and state in the United States, because we had written that into our First Amendment. And not only was Thomas Jefferson one to articulate that in the early United States of America, but before him, two presidents in advance, George Washington gave the same assurances that all people would be treated equally in terms of their faith when he wrote to the Jewish community in Rhode Island. And note that in the little clip I've provided you here that George Washington uses Roger Williams' wording, liberty of conscience. He says that all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities that citizenship provides us, and the government of these United States gives no bigotry to sanction, no persecution, no assistance. To bigotry, no sanction. To persecution, no assistance. And our government requires only that they who live under its protection should carry themselves as good citizens and affect support of this government. And the president goes on to address the children of Abraham, saying, "May the children of Abraham who dwell in this land abide in peace. Everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." I love that phrase, which evokes for me, and maybe it does for you, in terms of the litany of America's greatest presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, that all Americans, indeed all the world, should live free from want and free from fear, because those are American virtues and values that we carry dear. So the greatest American presidents uphold and promote our cherished American values. Where do we get these? I speak unendingly from the early documents that we need to go to refer to how our country was founded. Our founding documents, I've only just barely referenced them in a few. And what we've talked about initially have been the American values that we have obtained from the founding period of our country. But beyond these founding values, moving forward, I'm adding another very classic historic perspective to our framework for considering American values, looking through the lens of America's frontier narrative in defining who we are. So our frontier spirit was articulated by a person by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890s. He was a historian, and if you've had any form of second semester U.S. history, surely you have read, if not all, at least parts of his frontier thesis. He presented that numerous times in many different ways, and essentially what he talked about was that America's frontiers shifted, and they moved from east to west with our American settlement, and then in each case, grappling with and dealing with a frontier that had to be settled, created a spirit and a character in Americans that is part of fundamentally our values and who we are. So this individual advancement follows the geographical advancement. It required initiative and a can-do spirit. Moving west took down our class distinctions. It opened us up for potential social advancement. It was more democratizing. It was an optimistic venture because you sought the new when you continued to move ever west. This was also part of the American dream. We were being inventive and creative, and this spirit of optimistic adventure is built into the character of us as part of our frontier spirit. And Turner went on to question whether when the frontier closed, as he was commenting on in the 1890s, whether our American spirit would begin to shrivel and die. But we know from history, again, that new frontiers were invented with the closing of the continental United States to frontier settlement, as we perceived it from the 19th century. We began looking outward, and an era of American imperialism commences. By the time we get to the 20th century, John F. Kennedy articulates the new frontier of space exploration. So America's frontiers continue to move outward, and they do today. And I ask you to think about, do we, if we are landlocked here in the United States, do we stew among ourselves? Have we no longer become outward focused in terms of, do we have to define ourselves as being setting up for conquests? Or can we seek the frontiers of new ideas? When we call all this down to what are the component pieces of frontier spirit and frontier adventure and frontier enterprise that can be amalgamated into one word, I've picked optimism. And I've picked optimism to sort of represent and codify that American spirit for the frontier spirit, because we are the new world and we're constantly creating newness. The new frontier is where we must always be going. The American optimism is who we are, and again, it's a core American value. So imagine my pleasure just a couple of weeks ago when the mailman came to the door and brought my mail, that the mid-January Time magazine showed that Bill Gates, who was guest editing for Time, decided to focus on optimism as a key American value. And he's thinking about the world, of course. He's saying that there's a lot in this time period to be really, really, really optimistic about. And I would certainly support that. When I picked up the magazine to go upstairs to read it, I went into my office, and there sitting right next to my computer terminal is my little personal sign that says, "Be optimistic," because I'd like to think I try to do that. One must be optimistic, I think, to be an American. I do the American Democracy Project for a living. I work with MT Engage, engaging others in our society, in your own lives and in your personal education. I know what that's about. I know that civic engagement is about putting yourself out there, that our society is a nation by, for, and of the people, that we the people must own the society around us and take responsibility for it. It has to be done. It's doable. And to know that and to act on it is an act actually of sheer national optimism that we really need to engage in on a day-to-day basis. Because if we don't, we are simply sheep who are enduring the American experience that's going on around us, and we are not owning it. New York Times journalist, and again, Yale professor David Brooks, who's one of my very favorite thinkers and writers in the current day, in an article he wrote just last month, speaks out for democracy. And he talks about that in the latter part of the 1980s, the Berlin Wall fell and democracy sprouted around Europe. Apartheid fell in South Africa. Democracy's looking really hopeful. We Americans are patting ourselves on the back as having had a voice and been involved in this. And then he says it all went bad. Tribalism and authoritarianism are on the march, he observes in December of last month, as democracies around the globe decline. And it's happening too in our own country, he says. Congress barely functions. The White House ignores facts and violates basic tenets of decency. College campuses, he says 50% due to certain studies, say that offensive speech should be shouted down, and a certain percentage believe that it should be crushed. He says, in short, we need to have a framework for decency that we hold ourselves to. We have taken our basic American values for granted for too long, and we've forgotten how to defend them. So we have to really move forward in that regard and take a proactive stance on defending American values. He uses as an example Thomas Mann, who was a 20th century Nobel laureate and German refugee, who, in this particular quote that is from David Brooks' article, but he's citing Thomas Mann's work on the coming victory of democracy that he wrote in response to the expansion of Nazism and communism across Europe in the 1930s in Europe. And Thomas Mann, and together with David Brooks, they're sort of interfacing between their two voices, says the democracy is about the dignity of individual men and women who are made in God's image. And humans are the only creatures who can understand and seek justice, freedom, and truth. Democracy is the only system built on respect for the infinite dignity of each individual man and woman, and on each person's moral striving for freedom, justice, and truth. And Democracy encourages everybody to act on their best capacities. It holds that we have a moral responsibility to act, and we must act through life and through our actions. Meaning, a democracy is an active engagement. There are obstructionists, of course, who like to stop action, but true democracies are about hope and optimism, because when you are proactive, you are acting in an optimistic fashion. And we as citizens, we as Americans, every time we go vote, every time we engage in political debate, we're putting ourselves out there. And it's incumbent on us to do that. We can't sit back and opine about the government or them or they, someone else to whom we point a finger, because that's cynical and that destroys democracies. We must be active agents in the creation of our country and be involved. And we have a moral responsibility to do so, says Thomas Mann, to engage around us. If we want to take another governmental tactic, we can engage ourselves in a democracy that requires that we just be and we don't think or control. And despotisms do the same thing. They do not want us to think or engage. After Charlottesville this past summer, Nicolas Whittaker, who's an undergraduate, as you are, he's at Harvard, he wrote in the Harvard Crimson, America is in our hands. And I would say, yes, it is. George Lakoff, on the other hand, argues that Americans vote their values and not their best interest. So the question is, what the heck are our values? I'm pretty sure what my values are, and I'm going to vote them. What are your values, and have you thought about them? Have you articulated them? I could give you essentially an infinite list of my own, but these are a few that I've selected to reference. These are rooted in our founding narrative and our frontier narrative, and I view them as solid, firm, and as true today as they were centuries ago. And so in many ways, I consider myself an originalist. But I give it that the racist, misogynist, white elite, white males who wrote the Constitution, I give them a lot of credit because they, in spite of themselves, inspired and laid out for us a pathway toward a more perfect union. In reality, our immutable principles have adapted. Whereas getting along with American Puritans and American Anglicans was maybe our initial struggle, an early challenge, those challenges are much more complex today, and we have many more areas of difference that we are called upon to become democratic, a beloved community together in order to be Americans. So we do adapt, and we adapt to the problems and issues at hand, but the American values that I care about are honestly solid as a rock. We must each act with optimism and purpose to daily form the more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And that's what I stand for. What do you stand for? What are your American values?
Thank you, Dr. Evans. We have just a couple of minutes. If there are any questions or comments, we will take them now. Yes?
I'm going to play a devil's advocate for a minute. What do you think of WikiLeaks? On one side, it is informing the country of maybe our wrongdoings of being more transparent. On the other side, it's quite damaging.
I hear you, and being an academic, I weigh both sides, and I feel both sides. I see both sides, and yet I'm reminded from my era, when I was in college, the whole release of the Pentagon Papers was utterly and completely analogous and equivalent to me, and it was exceedingly difficult because it was exposing a nasty underbelly. So I think I'm sufficiently conservative that I hate that, and I'm sufficiently liberal that I appreciate full knowledge and full disclosure. I'm so pleased not to have to play God or Solomon, so I don't have to be the one to decide. But complex issues are never easy to decide. That's the very nature by which they are complex.
Question?
I don't really have a question, more just a comment about something you said. You mentioned the frontier narrative and optimism. And I definitely agree with that. But for me, and considering this history, different classes, in every class, you know, traveling west to the frontier also meant slaughtering
Yep.
Native Americans,
Yep.
indigenous people, millions of them.
Yep.
And it's just part of our history that I can't resolve.
Well, we can't resolve it. And I think, again, if we have this goal of establishing justice and working toward the more perfect union, given the framework that we have now, that's how the essential core principles adapt to the issues that we have at hand currently. And we see it with our 21st century eyes, hopefully our late 20th century eyes. You're 100% and completely correct. And that's the flip side of all of that. Sir.
You mentioned Ferguson's dictum, act as a man of thought, think as a man of action. And you also mentioned that sometimes the society would like to opine and kind of whine about the state of the union, but not actually do something about it. How do we better educate our people to understand how to voice their opinion and be men and women of action in a respectful manner?
Well, I would venture to say that, every day in every way we're getting better and better. It's incumbent on us. We can't just have it crammed down our throats. Every American citizen who matures and grows, it's incumbent on him or her to seek the kind of information and to do the digging and do the work. And yeah, our classes and our courses should all have components of civic learning in them. I mean, that's one of the things we advocate here within this university, that across every discipline and in every course, there needs to be an element of civic learning that is, citizenship is not just for poli-sci majors. It is for 100% of us. And if we come out of here with a recording industry degree or a nursing degree or a business degree, we're going out into society being citizens. And if your faculty have failed to address the fundamental civic issues in your discipline, you need to call them on the carpet for that and tell them to get with the civic learning program in addition to the disciplinary material that they're providing you. So it is ongoing, and I would say the best way to do it is up and act. And I know the sooner we form habits of citizenship, the more they last for a lifetime. Again, studies have been done on this ad nauseum over the last number of years, particularly with college students. And we know the sooner, for instance, people start voting, the more consistently they do it. And if they don't start early, they tend to not vote and say it's not my job, or I don't care, or it's not my business, or that doesn't impact me. Baloney to that. It all impacts us. And if we are creating, it's a republic if we can keep it, but it's incumbent on us to do it. It's not your mom and daddy's job. It's yours.
Very along with his and your themes on the voting, I think what we learned from the last election was how important the primaries are. And also college students, if it involves you getting an absentee ballot, get it, because you're all 18.
Voting is critical. My office is just upstairs in this building. If you are not registered to vote, I can help you and I can discuss where you ought to do it. Here's a rule of thumb. Students vote where they sleep, where they park their car at night. So if you're a commuter and you drive to Murfreesboro from Cannon County or Davidson County, then you should register back home in those counties. If you sleep here, you need to become a Rutherford County voter. And there are elections going on right now. I can get you registered this afternoon, and you can vote in the March 13th primary for State House, for the Senate seat, Tennessee Senate seat number 14, the 4th Senate district here in this state. If you don't think that's relevant, you are naive in the extreme. It's bottom up, and it's time to get involved in local issues. All politics is local, and so goes our community and our state, so goes the nation.
Okay, with that, we will conclude today. Thank you again, Dr.